final unit in our introduction to the book of Revelation, we're going to talk about structure. When we are traveling, it's helpful to have a road map. This enables us to figure out where we are and how to get from A to B. Similarly, when studying a book of the Bible, it's helpful to know and understand the structure of that book. That's especially true for Revelation, because understanding the structure will give us some important keys to understanding the book correctly. And for this reason, this whole unit will be about the structure of the book of Revelation. This is the roadmap, or horizontal chart, or structural diagram for the book of Revelation. Now, don't worry about the fact that you can't read it. It's just to give you the overall picture. You can tell that this looks a bit more complicated than the structure of the average book, and therefore I will take quite a bit of time to explain this chart. The first thing to notice, in the upper left and the upper right corner, we have the beginning and the end of the book in the form of a prologue or foreword in the first 8 verses, and then an epilogue or afterword starting in chapter 22, verse 6. And the rest of the book, everything in between, is arranged in columns here. These columns begin with the letters, the 7 letters, go all the way through the book down to Jerusalem from heaven. And notice on the very left there's a column that's not part of the text, but that divides these other columns into 7 scenes. More about those 7 scenes in a moment. First, notice that each column also has a setting, and some of them have a church interlude, an intermezzo, a break, an interruption in the flow. The setting in each case sets the stage for the series of scenes that then follows. And in most cases, it shows us an element of the heavenly throne room or the heavenly temple, which is the same place. This is an overview of the settings in the book. First, in chapter 1, we have Jesus in the midst of the 7 lampstands. This prepares for the 7 letters. Then we have a description of the heavenly throne room, which is all of chapters 4 and 5. It's a very long setting. It leads to the scroll with the 7 seals. Then comes the altar of incense in chapter 8, which introduces 7 trumpets. At the end of chapter 11, we see the Ark of the Covenant, which prepares for a special series of signs. In chapter 15, the temple is filled with smoke. And chapter 19, well, this one's a little different because it's not so much an element of the temple. We get to see Jesus as the rider on the white horse. The final section of the book, the description of the New Jerusalem, is not introduced with such a setting, but instead its introduction parallels exactly the introduction of Babylon in chapter 17. Now, these settings have a lot to do with the content of the section that follows. For instance, Jesus in the midst of the 7 lampstands. Now, the lampstands, we are told, are the 7 churches. It is to these churches that the letters are then written and sent. So, setting and content of the following section are connected in each case. Interludes are not so many. We have the 144,000 in chapter 7, and then after an encounter with the mighty angel and the measuring of the temple, we have the 2 witnesses in Revelation 10 and 11. Revelation 15 verse 1 is also an interruption, but it's more a foretaste, a look ahead at what is still to come. John sees the angels with the 7 last plagues. Back to the horizontal chart. How did I come up with 7 scenes? Well, in some cases this is quite obvious. There are 7 letters. There is a scroll with 7 seals, and with each seal there is a scene, something happens. There are 7 trumpets, there are 7 bowls. They are numbered in the text. This makes one wonder if perhaps the other columns are also divided into 7 units. And it turns out that they are. In the column marked signs, there are 7 scenes that are introduced in Greek with the exact same words, and I saw. Unfortunately, this is often lost in translation. And the same is true for the column marked Judgment in chapter 19 and 20. There too, there are 7 scenes introduced with the exact same words in Greek, and I saw. This leaves us with the columns Babylon and Jerusalem, 2 cities that make a strong contrast toward the end of the book. The description of Jerusalem is not divided. This is the consummation, the eternal state. The structure has evaporated. It does contain the number 7. There are 7 things, so we are told, that are not, and 7 other things that are no more, but this doesn't lead to 7 scenes or 7 units in the text. It's different with Babylon. Here we have 7 statements, 7 voices that speak out and make a statement. So there too we find the number 7 in the structure. This means that the structure of Revelation is dominated by the number 7, because not only are there 7 scenes in each column, but if we take the judgment on Babylon and the other judgment together, there are also 7 columns. In other words, the structure of Revelation is 7 times 7. The next thing that we need to notice about the structure is its parallelism. First, look at what is yellow here. Some of the trumpets and some of the bowls are quite similar to each other. With the trumpets, 1/3 of something is hit or impacted. With the bowl, it's the whole, but otherwise it's similar. There is a parallel between several trumpets and the corresponding bowls. Then, more importantly, there's the pattern we see with the numbers 6 and 7, here in red and blue. The number 6 tends to be bad in the book of Revelation, and scene number 6 is particularly bad. It confronts us with the end. It shows us the last judgment or the day of the Lord or something related. And then scene number 7 shows us what comes after the end. Nevertheless, the book doesn't stop there. With scene 7, we haven't reached the end of the book. It continues, or rather, it goes back to an earlier stage and starts to cover some of the same ground again, but this time from a different angle. The one exception here is the column of the 7 letters. They do not show this pattern. The 6th letter is to Philadelphia, which is a good church, and letter number 7 goes to Laodicea, which is a particularly bad church, but otherwise the pattern holds. Also, horizontally. Notice that column 6, Babylon, and the series of judgments combined gives us the last judgment once again, and column 7 gives us the description of the Jerusalem from above and describes the eternal state, what comes after the day of the Lord. 2 examples to help us see this pattern in the text. First, from chapter 6, John writes, "When he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold," and now comes some highly apocalyptic language, "there was a great earthquake, the sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that's being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place." And then people respond, "The great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" So this is the end. It's the day of the Lord, the day of his return, the day of judgment, and yet we're only in chapter 6. This does not happen before the 7 trumpets or before the signs, even though these are described later in the book. Second example, the 7th trumpet. When John encounters the mighty angel in chapter 10, he is promised that in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the 7th angel, the mystery of God would be fulfilled just as he announced to his servants the prophets. Or in other words, at that point it will all be finished and completed. And in chapter 11 we read what happens. Quote, "The 7th angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Now, this clearly is the completion. It's what follows the end. But we're only halfway through the book. And in chapter 12, John goes back to a much earlier stage in the story. In fact, chapter 12 starts with something that was already in the past when John was writing the birth of Christ. We have then in this book parallelism, and as a result recapitulation or repetition. At the end of each column we come to the end of salvation history, and then in the next column the book goes back to an earlier stage and covers some of the same ground from a different perspective. The book of Revelation is not chronological. One more thing to notice about this chart is the repetition of the phrase "in the Spirit," although unfortunately this too is sometimes lost in translation. The phrase appears in the book 4 times and marks places where an important transition takes place. The first occurrence is 1 verse 10, and there it initiates John's visionary experience. In 4 verse 2 it follows the call to come up into heaven, and then John is in the Spirit, and that's how he gets there. And in chapter 17 verse 3 John is carried in the Spirit to a place from where he can see the great prostitute, and in 21 verse 1 he is carried in the Spirit to a place where he gets to see the New Jerusalem. So the phrase breaks the book into several larger blocks of material. And in closing, this is a crucial point to keep in mind. The book is not chronological. It does not cover events from beginning to end in chronological order, and therefore we cannot construct a timetable, timeline, calendar of end-time events based on the book of Revelation. It doesn't work.